They did not just knock on my door at 2 in the morning. They shattered it into 100 pieces. When the dust settled, they told me I was going away for a very long time. My wife stood watching, crying tears that I would soon learn were nothing but a calculated performance. Hours later, sitting in a cold interrogation room, a smug local detective ran my file through the federal database. I watched the blood completely drain from his face as his computer screen locked up and flashed a top-secret warning. Minutes later, the heavy door swung open, and the director of the FBI walked in. He looked at the terrified local cops and said, "Take those handcuffs off him right now. You have absolutely no idea who you just arrested." My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old. I spent my entire life building a respectable financial firm in Alexandria, Virginia, sacrificing everything to provide a life of luxury for my family. But what I did not know was that the people living under my roof were meticulously planning my destruction. If you have ever felt the cold sting of betrayal from the people you trusted most, please hit the like button. It brings a lot of comfort to this old man's heart. Let me know in the comments where you are watching this story from today and what time it is there right now. It was a Tuesday night, or rather the very early hours of a Wednesday morning. The house was completely silent. Living in a sprawling estate in Alexandria usually meant peaceful, interrupted nights. I was deep in sleep, resting my 70-year-old bones after what I thought was just another normal day of managing my private financial consulting firm. Then the world exploded. A sound like thunder ripped through the quiet darkness of the mansion. It was the distinct, violently loud crack of a heavy steel battering ram, completely obliterating my solid oak front doors. The noise was so sudden and so incredibly loud that my heart instantly hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Before my brain could even process that we were under attack, heavy boots were already pounding up the grand, sweeping staircase. I sat up in bed, my chest heaving, trying to shake off the thick fog of sleep. Flashing red and blue lights cut aggressively through the gaps in the heavy blackout curtains, throwing wild, chaotic shadows across the bedroom walls. I reached for the bedside lamp, but before my fingers could even brush the switch, the double doors to my master bedroom were kicked open with a terrifying force. Blinding beams of tactical flashlights hit me squarely in the eyes. I raised my hands instinctively, completely disoriented and blinded by the glaring white light. Multiple voices were shouting over each other in the darkness, harsh and aggressive commands echoing off the high ceilings. "Police, keep your hands where we can see them. Get out of the bed right now. Do not make a single move." I am a 70-year-old man. My body does not move with the speed or agility it once did. I tried to speak to ask what on earth was going on, to tell them they clearly had the wrong house, but they gave me absolutely no chance to utter a single word. Rough, unyielding hands grabbed my shoulders, pulling me forcefully from the warmth of my bed. My bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor, and before I could even find my balance, I was spun around and slammed hard against the bedroom wall. The impact knocked the wind completely out of my lungs. I gasped for air, my cheek pressed against the smooth, cold paint of the wall. I could feel the rough fabric of tactical vests pressing into my back. This was not a simple knock on the door for a noise complaint. This was a full-scale, highly aggressive midnight raid. "You are making a massive mistake," I finally managed to choke out, my voice raspy and trembling from the sudden shock. "I am Harrison Caldwell. Who is in charge here?" A man stepped forward, his silhouette cutting through the blinding flashlight beams. He was a local lead detective wearing a cheap suit and a look of absolute arrogant triumph on his face. He looked at me not as a respected businessman, but as a piece of garbage he had just scraped off the bottom of his shoe. "We know exactly who you are." Mr. Caldwell, the detective sneered, his voice dripping with venom and utter contempt. "You are under arrest." He grabbed my wrists, pulling them forcefully behind my back. The cold, heavy steel of handcuffs snapped tightly around my wrists, the metal biting sharply into my aged skin. The physical pain of the tight metal was completely eclipsed by the sheer, unadulterated confusion flooding my mind. Handcuffs, arrest. These were words that simply did not belong in my world. I had lived a life of strict discipline, quiet wealth, and spotless public reputation. You have the right to remain silent, the detective continued, reciting the Miranda rights with a mechanical rhythm as he patted me down roughly. But frankly, with the evidence we just received, nothing you say is going to save you anyway. You are being charged with federal wire fraud, massive tax evasion, and the direct embezzlement of $15 million from your pensioner client accounts. The words hung in the totally chaotic air of my bedroom. Wire fraud, embezzlement, $15 million. My brain scrambled to make sense of the accusations. Embezzlement from pensioner accounts. My firm handled high net worth individuals and corporate trusts. Yes, we had pensioner funds, but those accounts were meticulously managed, audited securely, and locked down tight. My professional life was completely immaculate. I had spent 40 years ensuring that not a single penny was ever misplaced. Yet here was a local detective crashing through my doors in the dead of night, accusing me of stealing $15 million. Local police departments do not execute heavily armed, middle-of-the-night, tactical raids on wealthy 70-year-old financial consultants unless they have been handed a totally bulletproof, undeniably perfect package of evidence. White-collar crimes usually involve a polite knock on the door during business hours from a pair of federal agents holding a subpoena. A raid like this meant someone had deliberately painted me as an immediate flight risk. Someone had aggressively expedited this process. Someone had spoon-fed the local authorities a meticulously crafted narrative of my guilt. As the detective shoved me toward the bedroom door, the cold, hard reality began to settle over my racing mind. A stranger could not possibly fabricate financial records deep enough to trigger a midnight raid. A competitor could not possibly access my highly secured internal networks to plant false evidence. The only people who could orchestrate a frame job of this incredible magnitude were the people who had unrestricted access to my life, my home, and my personal company servers. I stumbled slightly as they pushed me out of the bedroom and into the brightly lit massive hallway of the second floor. My knees felt incredibly weak, not just from the rough physical treatment, but from the horrifying realization that was currently blooming in my chest. The wolves were not outside my gates. The wolves had been living inside my home. As the officers marched me roughly toward the top of the grand staircase, I forced myself to look up. I expected to see my family huddled in absolute terror, crying out for me, demanding to know why the police were taking their father and husband away like a violent criminal. Instead, I saw them standing near the entrance of the East Wing. My family. The people I had sacrificed my entire life to provide for. They were standing right there at the top of the stairs, looking down at me as the police prepared to march me away to a federal prison. And as our eyes locked in the harsh, chaotic lighting of the raided mansion, the final, completely devastating piece of the puzzle violently clicked into place, changing my life and my understanding of the people I loved forever. Victoria stood on the landing of the second floor, clutching her silk robe. For 20 years, she had been my partner, the person I trusted above all others. Now she was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with theatrical sobs. She wailed, her voice echoing down the foyer, crying about how I had destroyed our family name. She cried about the shame I had brought upon our pristine lives. Even from the bottom of the stairs, surrounded by aggressive officers, I could see the truth in her posture. Real grief makes a person collapse inward. Victoria stood perfectly straight, ensuring the detectives had a clear view of the devastated innocent wife. Preston, the boy I took in when he was 15, stood directly in front of her. I paid for his Ivy League education. I mentored him. I just promoted him to vice president of my firm, handing him the keys to a kingdom he did not build. Now he stood with his chest puffed out in an arrogant stance. He looked down at me with a manufactured expression of utter disgust. He shook his head, projecting the image of a disappointed son who had just discovered his lifelong hero was a monster. Lingering behind them, half hidden in the shadows, was his wife Monica. She did not even pretend to cry. She held her smartphone up, pointing the lens directly at me, recording my humiliation. I could hear her venomous voice muttering insults. She called me an arrogant criminal, She whispered that I was finally getting exactly what I deserved. "How could you do this to us, Harrison?" Victoria screamed down the staircase, her voice cracking with practiced emotion. "After everything we built together, after 20 years, you lied to all of us. You stole from hardworking people. How am I supposed to look our friends in the eye again?" Her words hit the heavy air of the foyer, soaking into the minds of the arresting officers. The lead detective gripped my arm tighter, his face hardening with self-righteous anger, buying into her narrative. Preston took a step forward, placing a hand on his mother's shoulder, looking down at me with cold, dead eyes. "I looked up to you," he said, his voice loud enough for every cop to hear. "I modeled my career after you. I thought you were a man of honor, but you are just a greedy, pathetic thief. You sicken me. Do not ever contact us again." I remained silent. The officers forcefully nudged me forward, prompting me to walk toward the shattered remnants of my front door. My bare feet moved across the cold marble, but I did not look away from them. I did not yell. I did not plead my innocence. I did not beg my wife to call our lawyers. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal acted like a heavy iron anchor holding my tongue in place. As a veteran of the financial world, my panic evaporated, replaced by a chilling clarity. Fear gave way to cold, hard logic. I know exactly how federal financial investigations operate. Federal wire fraud and embezzlement are complex crimes. When the authorities investigate a prominent financial firm, they send polite men in cheap suits carrying folders of federal subpoenas. They quietly freeze bank accounts. They conduct months of exhaustive audits. They absolutely do not send a heavily armed tactical team to smash down the doors of a 70-year-old man at 2 a.m. A raid of this aggressive nature only happens under one specific condition. It happens when the authorities are handed a perfectly wrapped, undeniable package of evidence that points directly to an immediate flight risk. Someone had to have spoon-fed these local detectives a mountain of fraudulent ledgers and manufactured bank transfers. Someone with absolute access to my most secure corporate servers. Someone who knew the daily inner workings of my firm. It had to be Preston. He was the vice president. He had the required high-level clearance. He had the administrative passwords. He had the direct ability to manipulate the digital infrastructure of my entire life's work. And Victoria, my loving wife, had clearly helped him set the stage at home, ensuring I was completely isolated, unmedicated, and caught off guard. They had meticulously orchestrated this entire raid. They wanted me dragged out of my home in chains, publicly ruined, and removed from the picture. The cool night air hit my face as the officers shoved me out of the front door. The flashing blue and red lights from the cruiser illuminated the perfectly manicured lawn of the estate my hard-earned money had paid for. I could see the warm yellow lights turning on in the neighboring houses. Heavy oak doors were slowly creeping open. The wealthy neighborhood of Alexandria was waking up to witness the downfall of Harrison Caldwell. "Watch your head," the detective barked, placing a heavy hand on my skull and pushing me roughly into the back of the freezing hard plastic seat of the police cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut with a sickening thud, locking me inside a cage of reinforced glass and steel. Through the thick window of the cruiser, I looked back at the grand entrance of my home. The police were quickly wrapping up their sweep of the foyer. In that brief moment, right before the patrol car pulled away, the shadows shifted near the doorway. I saw Victoria Preston and Monica standing closely together. The police were no longer looking at their direction. Victoria was no longer crying. The theatrical sobs had completely vanished. Her posture relaxed entirely, and a slow, cruel smirk spread across her face. Preston stood proudly beside her, casually crossing his arms, looking deeply satisfied with his handiwork. Monica lowered her phone, grinning widely as she typed on the glowing screen. They looked exactly like hungry predators watching a carcass being dragged away by scavengers. They actually thought they had won. They truly believed they had successfully discarded a senile old man and securely stolen a $20 million empire for themselves. They thought my silence was the absolute silence of a defeated, broken victim who had simply given up. As the cruiser violently lurched forward, speeding down the dark streets toward the station, I slowly closed my eyes and let the steady rhythm of the tires calm my breathing. The absolute coldness inside my chest solidified into a diamond-hard resolve. I desperately needed to retrace their steps. I needed to carefully dissect every single lie, every single manipulation, every calculated move they had made to build this elaborate trap. My mind shifted backward, meticulously rewinding the precise timeline of my own life. The puzzle pieces had not fallen into place tonight. This incredible disaster was not a sudden accident. The deadly trap had been set exactly 90 days ago. It began on a quiet Tuesday evening when the very first crack appeared in their seemingly flawless facade. It was a subtle, deadly crack they foolishly thought I was simply too old, too tired, and far too blind to ever notice. Exactly 90 days before the police shattered my front door, I was sitting alone in my private home office. The house was wrapped in the deep, heavy silence that only arrives long after midnight. Victoria was fast asleep upstairs, or at least I firmly believed she was, and the world outside my window was completely still. At 70 years old, my sleep was often broken and restless, a lingering side effect of 4 decades spent managing immense wealth for highly demanding clients. On quiet nights like this, I found profound comfort in the predictable rhythm of numbers and data. I poured myself a small glass of sparkling water, turned on the antique brass desk lamp, and booted up my highly secure corporate laptop. I had been slowly and methodically preparing for my official retirement. For months, I had been gradually transferring my daily operational duties to Preston, actively grooming him to eventually take over the vast financial empire I had built from the ground up. I deeply trusted the boy. I had paid for his expensive university tuition, patiently guided his career, and consistently treated him with the exact same respect I would have given my own biological son. But before I could fully step away and officially hand over the keys to the kingdom, my meticulous nature demanded a comprehensive line-by-line review of the final quarter ledgers. It was meant to be a simple routine check to ensure the client accounts were perfectly balanced before the formal handover. I securely logged into the primary corporate server using my exclusive administrator credentials, deliberately bypassing the standard graphical user interface to look directly at the raw financial data. Almost immediately, my highly trained eyes caught something that made the air in my lungs grow completely cold. The numbers on the glowing screen did not align. It was a glaring, massive anomaly sitting right in the absolute center of our most secure client reserve fund. This specific fund was designed strictly as a highly conservative holding account for our oldest, most vulnerable pensioners. It was heavily regulated, closely monitored, and meant to be virtually untouchable under normal market conditions. Yet according to the raw data glowing mercilessly on my computer screen, exactly $2 million had been completely drained from the protected account. I leaned much closer to the high-resolution monitor, blinking hard and rubbing my eyes. I was initially convinced that my tired vision was simply playing a cruel trick on me in the darkness of the study. I immediately refreshed the secure portal, manually ran a secondary diagnostic check on the system, and pulled the raw database transactional logs. The terrifying numbers did not change. $2 million had not simply vanished into the digital ether due to a technical glitch. It had been deliberately, intentionally, and meticulously routed out of our secure corporate ecosystem. My heart began to pound, a slow, incredibly heavy rhythm against my ribs as I initiated a trace. I needed to aggressively follow the missing funds. What I rapidly uncovered was a highly sophisticated, deeply criminal maze of financial obfuscation. The money had been expertly split into dozens of smaller, seemingly innocuous transactions, designed specifically to systematically evade the automated flagging systems of federal banking regulators. From our secure reserve fund, the massive capital was seamlessly funneled into a domestic holding company, discreetly registered in Delaware. From there, it was immediately wired across international borders, bouncing rapidly and silently through a highly complex network of shadowy offshore shell companies. It moved untraceably from banks in Cyprus. Then it shifted quickly to the Isle of Man and finally disappeared entirely into a private corporate trust located securely in the Cayman Islands. This was definitely not a simple accounting error. This was not a misplaced decimal point, a rogue algorithmic trade, or a delayed international bank transfer. This was a textbook, highly professional money laundering operation happening directly under my roof and utilizing my pristine company name. A profound, icy dread began to spread rapidly through my veins. I had spent 15 deeply secretive years working covertly as a specialized ghost auditor for the Department of Justice. I spent my hidden career actively hunting down international financial syndicates and tearing apart corrupt institutions. I knew exactly what a large-scale cartel washing cycle looked like, and I was looking at one perfectly executed inside my own private firm. But to execute a transfer of this massive magnitude, completely bypassing our strict internal security protocols, required top-tier administrative clearance. A low-level accountant could never possibly authorize this type of transaction. An external hacker would have instantly triggered a dozen separate corporate firewall alarms before even accessing the first server. The call was coming from inside. The betrayal was coming directly from inside the house. My fingers flew aggressively across the keyboard, immediately bringing up the digital signature logs for the initial unauthorized transfer. I bypassed the superficial user interface and dug directly into the deepest server routing history, firmly demanding the system show me the exact physical terminal that had maliciously authorized the theft. The powerful computer processed the urgent request, the screen flashing for a few agonizing seconds before finally displaying the undeniable result. My breath hitched violently in my throat. The digital footprint led directly to a highly specific internal IP address. It was the secure terminal located directly in the vice president's office. It was Preston. I sat completely frozen in my large leather chair, staring blankly at his name glowing mercilessly on the bright screen. The boy I had lovingly raised, the young man I had welcomed into my home, fed, clothed, and proudly elevated to a position of immense corporate power. He had brazenly used the very access I generously granted him to rob my most vulnerable elderly clients. A sickening wave of nausea washed violently over me, closely followed by a burning, intensely furious anger. I immediately activated the private secure printer cleverly hidden in the corner of my dark study. The mechanical whir and rhythmic hum of the machine filled the silent room as it quickly spat out page after page of undeniable, absolutely damning digital evidence. I slowly gathered the warm papers, neatly stacking them into a thick, heavy file folder. I did not sleep a single minute for the rest of that night. I simply sat in the dark, watching the sun slowly rise over the quiet Virginia hills, feeling a massive, destructive, heavy storm gathering on the horizon of my life. When morning finally broke, I took a cold shower, put on a sharp, tailored suit, and drove aggressively to the firm. I walked quickly past the main reception desk, my face completely set in stone, deliberately, ignoring the polite morning greetings of my office staff. I marched straight down the long executive hallway, the heavy evidence file gripped tightly in my right hand. I reached Preston's corner office, pushed the heavy glass door open violently without bothering to knock, and slammed the thick stack of ledgers directly onto the center of his polished desk. "I need a clear explanation," I demanded, my voice incredibly cold and hard. "I need it right now." Preston jumped slightly at the sudden sound of the heavy folders hitting his pristine mahogany desk. He looked up from his dual monitors, his eyes widening in brief, unadulterated panic. For a fraction of a second, I saw the absolute terror of a cornered animal flash across his face. A bead of sweat formed on his temple, gleaming under the bright office lights. But Preston had always been a remarkably fast learner. Before I could demand further answers, he blinked, inhaled deeply, and the confident mask of the vice president slid perfectly back into place. He let out a long, exhausted sigh, offering me a warm, highly practiced smile that completely failed to reach his eyes. He pushed his expensive ergonomic chair back and gestured for me to sit down. "I am so glad you found this, Harrison," he said, his tone incredibly smooth and remarkably steady. "I was actually going to bring this exact issue to your attention during our afternoon briefing today. Please sit down and let me show you what is actually going on here. I remained standing, my posture rigid, crossing my arms over my chest. I refused to let him control the physical space of the room. I told him I did not want to sit. I told him I wanted to know exactly where the $2 million from the Pensioner Reserve Fund had gone. Preston nodded slowly, projecting an aura of complete professional patience. He turned his attention back to his keyboards, his fingers moving rapidly across the keys. He pulled up a highly detailed, official-looking internal memorandum on his large secondary monitor and firmly rotated the screen so I could read it clearly. "This is not a theft, Harrison," he explained, his voice projecting the calm, reassuring authority of a seasoned financial executive. "What you are looking at is a massive, incredibly frustrating critical error within the new European accounting software integration we deployed last weekend. You remember the system upgrade we authorized to comply with the new international banking regulations, right?" I stared at the screen. The memorandum was stamped with the official logo of our external software vendor. It contained dense, highly technical jargon detailing a severe data routing glitch. Preston pointed to a complex flowchart on the document. "The money is not missing," he continued smoothly, tapping his expensive pen against the monitor. "The capital is completely safe and fully accounted for in the central holding ledger. However, the new software patch contains a critical visual interface bug. It is incorrectly reading our routine internal structural transfers as external unverified offshore movements. The dashboard is actively generating false positive alerts and misallocating the visual representation of the funds across random digital ghost accounts. It was a flawlessly constructed lie. If I were truly just an aging, out-of-touch financial consultant slowly losing his grip on modern banking technology, I would have absolutely bought it. The explanation was highly technical, completely plausible for a transitioning company, and supported by what looked like perfectly authentic documentation. He even anticipated my knowledge of international wire transfers by proactively explaining away the offshore routing codes I had discovered the night before. "Our dedicated information technology team has been working through the night to run a comprehensive patch to permanently fix this visual glitch," Preston added, closing the memorandum and leaning back in his chair. "They assure me the main dashboard will be perfectly balanced and fully restored to normal operating capacity by tomorrow morning. I promise you, Harrison, the pensioner funds are absolutely secure. Not a single penny has left this building." I kept my face entirely blank, forcing myself to suppress the intense burning urge to reach across the desk and grab him by the collar of his expensive custom suit. I needed him to believe that his brilliant manipulation had successfully completely pacified my suspicions. I slowly uncrossed my arms and let out a manufactured sigh of relief, deliberately letting my shoulders slump forward slightly to play the part of the exhausted, deeply stressed older man. Seeing my posture soften, Preston immediately shifted his strategy. He moved smoothly from professional defense directly into deeply personal psychological manipulation. He stood up, walked around the large mahogany desk, and placed a warm, seemingly affectionate hand gently on my shoulder. "Harrison, you are working yourself far too hard," he said, his voice dropping into a register of profound manufactured concern. "You were up at 3 a.m. checking raw database logs. That is not healthy for a man your age, especially not with your recent blood pressure issues. You have spent 4 decades carrying the massive weight of this entire firm directly on your shoulders. You built an absolute empire, but you are supposed to be transitioning into a peaceful retirement. You need to start trusting the dedicated team you personally trained. You need to trust me. I am here to carry this heavy burden for you now." The sheer audacity of his performance was genuinely breathtaking. He was looking me directly in the eyes, playing the role of the incredibly loyal, deeply devoted son, while simultaneously operating a massive, highly illegal financial scheme right under my nose. He was actively using my long history of hard work and my paternal affection as a weapon to completely blind me. "You are right, Preston," I replied, making sure to inject just the right amount of weary resignation into my voice. "I am incredibly tired. This system migration has simply put my nerves completely on edge. I apologize for jumping to such extreme conclusions without speaking to you first. Preston squeezed my shoulder reassuringly, a sickeningly triumphant smile now fully reaching his cold eyes. Do not apologize, Harrison. You are simply protective of our clients. That is exactly why this firm is so incredibly successful. Now please go home. Take the rest of the day off. Rest. Victoria called me this morning and said you looked terribly exhausted. Let me handle the system patch. I will personally ensure everything is perfectly resolved. I nodded, slowly, picked up my heavy file folder from his desk, and turned toward the door. I walked out of his office, projecting the exact image of a satisfied, deeply relieved father who had just been gently corrected by his highly competent successor. But internally, my mind was functioning with absolute razor-sharp precision. Preston had provided a brilliant, technically flawless excuse, but my 15 years as a covert federal auditor told me definitively that he was lying through his teeth. I left the corporate building and drove my car slowly back to the sprawling estate in Alexandria. I needed to maintain the complete illusion of my own ignorance. But as I pulled into the winding driveway, a deep anxiety began to claw at my stomach. I parked inside the garage, taking one last deep breath to steady my trembling hands before reaching for the heavy brass handle of the interior door. I was no longer stepping into a sanctuary. I was walking directly into a beautifully decorated trap where the psychological manipulation would continue, and where the most dangerous predator was waiting patiently for me right in the kitchen. The quiet hum of the central air conditioning greeted me as I closed the garage door behind me. I stood in the transitional mudroom for a moment, letting the cool air wash over my face. I looked down at the thick folder clamped under my right arm. Inside this leather-bound portfolio lay the definitive proof that my stepson Preston was operating a massive money laundering scheme through my consulting firm. My heart was thumping a hard, steady rhythm against my ribs, but I had to force my facial muscles into a mask of total exhaustion. If they suspected for a single second that I was onto them, the paper trail would vanish before sunset. I walked into the kitchen and found Victoria waiting for me. The space was pristine, smelling faintly of lemon-scented beeswax and freshly brewed chamomile. She looked up from the marble island, her eyes immediately scanning my face with a terrifying intensity. It was the look of a predator checking for any sign of resistance in its prey. I let my shoulders slump heavily. I allowed my eyelids to droop deliberately, projecting the image of a defeated, overwhelmed 70-year-old man. You look absolutely drained, darling, Victoria said, her voice dripping with a soft, melodic concern that made my skin crawl. Preston called me from the office. He told me you had a bit of a panic attack over the new software update. He was deeply worried about you. I offered her a weak, trembling nod, walking slowly toward my favorite leather armchair in the adjacent living room. I sank into the cushions, letting my head fall back. Yes, I murmured, rubbing my temples with my free hand. The numbers simply did not make sense to me. I thought I saw a massive discrepancy in the pensioner fund. My mind must be playing tricks on me in my old age. Victoria followed me into the living room carrying a silver tray. On it sat a delicate porcelain teacup filled with steaming chamomile tea and a small amber-colored glass bottle containing my daily prescription cardiotonic. She set the tray down on the side table with a soft clink. Then she moved gracefully behind my chair, her cool, soft hands coming down onto my tense shoulders. She began to knead the muscles at the base of my neck with a rhythmic, practiced pressure. You have spent 40 years carrying the weight of this entire empire, Harrison, she whispered, her breath warm against my ear as her thumbs dug into my skin. It is only natural that your mind is getting tired. Preston is a brilliant young man. He is working 14-hour days, sacrificing his own youth entirely to protect your legacy. When you walk into his office and accuse him of stealing it, is a profound insult to everything he is doing for this family. He is trying to shield you from the stress so you can finally enjoy your retirement. She reached over my shoulder, picking up the porcelain cup and handing it to me. Her touch was incredibly gentle, yet I felt as though an iron vice was closing around my throat. "Drink your tea, honey," she murmured softly. Her eyes locked onto mine with a sharp, unblinking focus. "And you need to take your medication. You know what the doctor said about your fluctuating blood pressure? If you skip even a single dose, your heart rate spikes, and that is when the paranoia and confusion start creeping back in." I looked down into the dark, swirling amber liquid of the tea. My mind flashed back to the vet clinic, to the image of my beautiful golden retriever violently vomiting blood after ingesting just a single dropped capsule of this very medication. A freezing wave of pure adrenaline crashed through my chest, but I did not let a single muscle in my face twitch. I looked back up at the woman I had loved for 2 decades, the woman I had protected and showered with immense wealth. She was standing over me, weaponizing my own medical history, gaslighting me into believing my sanity was slipping, all to hide the fact that she was actively helping her son systematically strip me of my life's work. I forced a weak, submissive smile to my lips. "You are right, Victoria," I murmured, my voice intentionally shaking as I picked up the small white capsule from the tray. "I am just a tired old man. I do not know what I would do without you to look after me." I lifted the porcelain cup to my mouth, blocking her view of my face for a split second. With a movement trained by years of covert field operations, I palmed the capsule, sliding it expertly beneath my tongue while pretending to swallow a large gulp of the hot tea. I set the half-empty cup back down on the silver tray, leaning my head back onto the headrest with an acting display of total compliance. Victoria stared at me for 3 long, agonizing seconds, verifying that the medicine was gone. Satisfied, the tight tension in her jaw relaxed completely. She reached down, patted my cheek with her cool hand, and picked up the tray. "That is my good boy," she said, her voice returning to that sweet, aristocratic tone. "Now I want you to close your eyes and rest. I am going to head upstairs to finish packing for our trip to the cabin. You need the mountain air, Harrison. It will help clear away all these dark, paranoid thoughts." She turned and walked slowly toward the grand staircase, the heels of her slippers clicking softly against the hardwood floor. I kept my eyes closed, pretending to drift into a deep, medicated slumber. But as her footsteps receded across the upper landing, I opened my eyes just a fraction of an inch. Through the reflection of the large gilded mirror on the living room wall, I watched her. Victoria stopped at the top of the stairs, turning back to look down at my motionless body. The sweet, devoted expression was completely wiped from her face. A subtle, bone-chilling smirk spread slowly across her lips. It was the look of a black widow spider watching its prey finally stop struggling in the web. She slipped quietly into the master bedroom, closing the heavy door behind her with a soft click. The moment she was gone, I spat the white capsule into a tissue, wrapping it tightly and sliding it deep into my pocket. I sat entirely still in the darkening living room, the absolute silence of the mansion heavy around me. But then a sudden, terrifying physical sensation shattered my concentration. A sharp, burning wave of absolute ice violently coursed down my left arm. My fingers began to tense up, turning completely numb and unresponsive. My heart rhythm stuttered, a heavy, erratic thud, hammering painfully against my chest cavity as a profound dizziness swamped my brain. I stared down at my shaking hand in the dim light. I had not swallowed the pill, but I had swallowed the tea. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The poison was not just in the cardiotonic. Victoria had laced the chamomile tea itself with a fast-acting secondary dosage. My breath hitched in my throat as the room began to spin, realizing that my countdown had just been aggressively accelerated. I forced myself out of the armchair, my legs trembling. My survival instinct overrode the chemical haze. I staggered toward the powder room, gripping the doorframe. Sinking to my knees before the toilet, I thrust 2 fingers deep into my throat. My body convulsed painfully, rejecting the toxic liquid. I stayed there for hours, gasping for air, flushing the evidence of my vulnerability away. When the nausea subsided into a dull ache, I splashed freezing water onto my face. I stared at my pale reflection. They wanted me dead, and they were accelerating their timeline. To survive, I had to embrace the role of the dying patriarch. An entire month crawled by in a blur of agonizing performances and silent observation. I poured my poisoned tea down the drain every night. I hid the lethal capsules in a decorative vase. To maintain my cover, I mimicked the severe symptoms of a failing cardiovascular system. I dragged my feet when I walked. I feigned intense bouts of brain fog, deliberately repeating questions during our conversations. Victoria played her part flawlessly, clucking her tongue in fake sympathy while guiding me to my chair. At the firm, my cognitive decline gave Preston the perfect excuse to seize total operational control. During our weekly executive summaries, he presented me with falsified financial reports. He adopted a tone of grave concern, explaining the company was experiencing a slight downturn due to shifting market variables. I simply nodded, playing the senile founder, praising his hard work while internally calculating the depth of his treason. The contradiction between his fabricated reports and his actual lifestyle soon became impossible to ignore. It began on a brisk Tuesday morning. I was standing near the windows of my corner office, leaning heavily on a wooden cane I did not need. I looked down into the executive parking lot. A low engine roar echoed through the concrete structure. A brand-new metallic black sports car glided smoothly into the parking space reserved for the vice president. The sleek vehicle was a European import that retailed for $150,000. The door swung upward, and Preston stepped out with a look of supreme arrogance. A man pulling a comfortable salary of $150,000 a year does not purchase a luxury supercar in cash while claiming his firm is suffering a financial downturn. The mathematics of his life simply did not align with reality. My analytical mind instantly dissected the purchase. To buy that vehicle without triggering a massive credit alert, he had to be utilizing a secure secondary stream of untaxed liquid capital. The brazen display of unjustified wealth escalated significantly that weekend. Victoria insisted on hosting a lavish Sunday dinner at the estate to celebrate what she continuously referred to as Preston stepping up to save the family business. The dining room table was set with our finest silver and crystal. The atmosphere was thick with their shared unspoken victory over my impending demise. As we sat down to the first course, Monica walked into the dining room, her heels clicking sharply. She took her seat next to Preston, casually brushing her hair back to deliberately expose her neckline. Resting heavily against her collarbone was a massive diamond necklace. The central stone was enormous, catching the light of the crystal chandelier and scattering brilliant flashes across the room. It was an unmistakable piece of custom jewelry, the kind of extravagant purchase that eclipses the cost of a luxury automobile. "That is a truly stunning piece of jewelry, Monica," I murmured, keeping my voice raspy and weak purposefully, letting my hand tremble as I lifted my water glass. "I do not believe I have seen you wear that before. Did you purchase it recently?" Monica offered a tight, condescending smile, glancing proudly at her husband. "Preston bought it for me just yesterday," she boasted, her voice laced with an undeniable edge of triumph. "He said I deserved a reward for being so supportive during this incredibly stressful corporate transition period." I shifted my gaze toward Preston, maintaining my facade of confused curiosity. "That is incredibly generous, son," I said slowly, measuring every single syllable. "But I recall you mentioning on Friday that the firm is currently tightening its belt due to the slight market downturn. A sports car and a diamond necklace seem like substantial expenditures for a period of corporate caution." Preston did not even flinch. He casually cut a piece of steak, chewing it slowly, before offering me a patronizing grin. "You do not need to worry about my personal finances, Harrison," he said smoothly. "The firm is absolutely secure, and my personal purchases have nothing to do with our corporate accounts. I made a series of incredibly lucky cryptocurrency investments a few months ago. The market surged unexpectedly, and I decided to cash out a portion of the digital wallet to treat myself and my beautiful wife. It is entirely separate from the business." His excuse was the universal shield for sudden, inexplicable wealth. Cryptocurrency was the perfect, untraceable scapegoat for young men drowning in illicit cash. But I knew exactly how he operated. A man as meticulously vain and socially anxious as Preston would never risk his own capital on volatile digital markets. He was a creature of structure, relying entirely on theft and deception to build his fortune. He was openly laundering the stolen $2 million directly through luxury assets, transforming the digital theft into physical commodities right in front of my face. They sat across from me, eating my food, drinking my wine, and wearing the stolen wealth of my most vulnerable clients. They were confident in my impending death, that they no longer felt the need to hide their greed in the shadows. They were openly flaunting the spoils of their treason, completely convinced that the old man at the head of the table was too blind, too sick, and too foolish to recognize the blood on their hands. I finished my meal in absolute silence, retreating to my study shortly after dessert, under the pretense of severe fatigue. The moment the wooden doors clicked shut and the lock engaged, the frail old man vanished. I walked purposefully to my desk, my spine perfectly straight, the fake wooden cane discarded carelessly in the corner of the room. I booted up my encrypted laptop, my fingers hovering over the keys. I was done waiting. It was time to initiate a comprehensive, devastating forensic audit of Preston's entire life. I was going to tear down the walls of his fake cryptocurrency portfolios, trace every single diamond, and follow the registration of his luxury car back to whatever shadowy offshore account he was utilizing. I prepared to launch the federal tracking software ready to unmask his entire operation. But before I could strike the very first key, the silence of the study was suddenly shattered by the sharp ringing of my private desk phone. It was a secure line known only to a select few individuals. I stared at the flashing red light, my hand freezing in midair. I slowly picked up the receiver, bracing myself for the absolute worst. The voice that erupted through the speaker was not a federal agent or a corporate lawyer. It was the frantic, breathless voice of Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was 82 years old, a retired structural engineer who had been my loyal client for more than 30 years. I had personally managed his life savings, building a secure portfolio designed to support him and his disabled wife. He was never prone to panic, but tonight his words tumbled out in a terrified rush. "Harrison, thank God you answered." Arthur gasped, his voice shaking with a terrifying intensity. "I had to dig through old address books to find this private number. Your main office switchboard refuses to connect me, and Preston has completely blocked my cellular phone number. I am locked out of everything, Harrison. My entire account is gone." I sat frozen, the heavy receiver pressed against my ear. "What do you mean your account is gone, Arthur?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain perfectly calm. "Calm down and tell me exactly what happened." "They took everything," Harrison Arthur cried, his frail voice cracking. 3 weeks ago, my online portal showed a zero balance. When I called Preston, he smoothly claimed it was a visual glitch from the new software upgrade. He promised me it would be fixed in 48 hours. But today, I received a certified letter in the mail. It was an official closure notice. It stated my entire portfolio had been completely liquidated at my own request. I never authorized a withdrawal. "My wife needs her medical treatments, Harrison. We are completely ruined." A profound sickness settled deep into my stomach. Preston's perfectly constructed lie was completely unraveling. He was not merely using my corporate infrastructure to quietly wash dirty cartel money. He was actively and aggressively cannibalizing the firm from the inside out. He was betraying the fundamental trust that I had spent 40 years building with this community. He was deliberately targeting vulnerable clients who lacked the technological savvy to verify their digital statements. "Arthur, listen to me very carefully," I said, injecting every ounce of authority I possessed into my voice. "Your money is not gone. I am personally handling this right now. Do not call the office again, and absolutely do not speak to Preston under any circumstances. I will fix this. I promise you on my life." I placed the receiver back onto the cradle. The lethargy from Victoria's daily toxic tea vanished, burned away by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. I turned my attention back to my encrypted laptop, my fingers flying rapidly across the glowing keyboard. I dove directly into the deepest architectural layers of the primary server. I initiated a direct search for Arthur Pendleton's master financial file. The secure system hummed softly in the quiet study, rapidly searching through millions of encrypted data points. Seconds later, the screen blinked and returned a glaring red error message. File not found. I aggressively expanded the search parameters, running a comprehensive diagnostic sweep. The results were absolutely devastating. Arthur's file had not been accidentally misplaced or temporarily archived due to a minor system glitch. It had been intentionally, methodically, and permanently eradicated from the primary server. Someone had manually executed a deeply invasive digital wipe, destroying his financial history and every record of his 30-year relationship with my firm. I immediately accessed the secure disaster recovery logs, pulling the digital footprint of the deletion event. The screen refreshed, highlighting the exact administrative credentials used to destroy the old man's life. The name Preston Caldwell glared back at me, glowing mercilessly in the dark room. The terrible weight of the evidence was undeniable. The facade was entirely shattered. The devastating truth hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. Preston was not just a greedy corporate opportunist making dangerous side deals. He was a ruthless, calculating predator. He had systematically identified my most defenseless clients, quietly liquidated their lifelong investments, and funneled their actual cash into his massive offshore laundering cycle. The luxury sports car sitting proudly in the executive parking lot, and the massive diamond necklace Monica wore so proudly at our Sunday dinner, were not purchased with lucky cryptocurrency investments. They were purchased directly with the stolen life savings of a desperate 82-year-old man. They were wearing Arthur's stolen future around their necks and driving it through the city streets. The absolute cruelty of the act stole the breath directly from my lungs. I realized in that specific moment that I could not wait another day. I could not continue to play the role of the sick, declining patriarch while Preston systematically robbed innocent people. I had to act immediately. I could not sit by and watch my legacy be transformed into a weapon of mass financial destruction. I needed to physically leave the house, drive directly to the nearest federal field office, and hand this massive mountain of evidence over to the authorities before Preston could successfully delete another client file from our remote servers. I quickly grabbed my portable hard drive, initiating a rapid, secure transfer of the catastrophic deletion logs. I watched the progress bar slowly fill each percentage point, representing a definitive nail in Preston's coffin. I forcefully pulled the small storage drive from the computer, dropping it securely into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I needed to move fast. I grabbed my car keys from the heavy mahogany desk and turned sharply toward the heavy oak door of my study. The urgent need to escape the estate pounded intensely in my brain. But as I reached for the polished brass handle, a sudden sharp electronic beep echoed loudly through the silent room. A heavy mechanical lock engaged with a violent, definitive thud. I grabbed the handle and twisted it aggressively, but the heavy door refused to move. The small digital keypad mounted on the adjacent wall, which normally glowed a soft, comforting blue, was now flashing a harsh, angry red. I quickly punched in my master security code, my fingers hitting the keys with frantic precision. Access denied. I pulled my cellular phone from my pocket to call the local police, but my heart stopped completely. The screen showed 0 signal bars. The private, secure wireless internet connection had also been entirely disabled by the main house router. I was completely trapped inside my own study. The thick, custom soundproof walls suddenly felt like the unyielding boundaries of a concrete tomb. There was no other exit, no window large enough to escape through. Then the heavy, suffocating silence was broken by the distinct, unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching slowly from the main hallway. I could hear Victoria speaking in a hushed, urgently excited whisper. I could hear the heavy, deliberate tread of Preston walking right beside her. I backed away from the locked door, my fists clenching tightly at my sides. They were not waiting for the slow-acting poison to finish its job anymore. They knew exactly what I was doing, and they had come to the door to finish it themselves. As the heavy footsteps stopped just outside my locked study door, my mind forcefully snapped back to the exact moment I first uncovered Victoria's lethal betrayal. My physical deterioration was not sudden. It had begun exactly 3 weeks before this terrifying confrontation, when a suffocating lethargy completely overtook my daily life. I was sitting in the living room feeling incredibly dizzy and profoundly weak. My vision blurred constantly, making it nearly impossible to focus on the simple financial documents resting on my lap. I blindly attributed the heavy brain fog to the relentless stress of the corporate transition. Victoria was playing the role of the devoted caregiver with absolute perfection. She walked gracefully into the living room that evening, carrying a small silver tray holding a glass of water and my daily cardiovascular medication. "Here you go, my love," she said, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone that I now recognize as pure, calculated venom. "You need to take your pill. Your heart rate has been irregular lately, and we need to keep you healthy for your retirement." I reached up with a trembling hand to take the innocent-looking white capsule from her fingers. My fine motor skills were severely compromised by the crushing fatigue. My fingers twitched, brushing against the capsule instead of grasping it. By a sheer miraculous stroke of luck, the pill slipped through my loose grip, bounced against the plush fabric of the armchair, and rolled across the hardwood floor. I watched it disappear completely into the deep, dark shadows beneath the heavy antique sofa. Victoria let out a sharp, irritated sigh. The mask of the loving wife slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of genuine anger that sent a strange chill down my spine. "Honestly, Harrison, you are becoming so incredibly clumsy," she snapped, her tone suddenly harsh and cold. "Do not bother trying to get down on the floor to look for it. You will only hurt your back. Just stay exactly where you are. I will fetch you a replacement capsule from the spare bottle." She turned on her heel and marched upstairs. I remained in the chair, too exhausted to care about her sudden temper. Returning minutes later, she handed me a new pill with a forced smile. I swallowed it obediently, unaware that I was actively participating in my own execution. I spent the entire evening drifting into unnatural sleep, the toxic chemicals silently working through my bloodstream. Later that night, the silence of the dark estate was shattered by a terrible sound. I woke up covered in cold sweat, my heart hammering a weak rhythm against my ribs. I listened closely in the darkness. It was coming from the downstairs hallway. It was a wet, agonizing, choking noise. I forced my heavy body out of bed, gripping the banister tightly as I navigated the stairs. I reached the bottom landing and turned on the hall light. What I saw instantly paralyzed me with absolute terror. My loyal golden retriever Duke was lying on his side on the Persian rug. He was convulsing violently, his chest heaving. A pool of dark red blood was spreading rapidly across the fabric, directly in front of his muzzle. He looked up at me with wide, panicked brown eyes, letting out a weak whimper that broke my heart. "Duke," I cried out, dropping to my knees beside him, ignoring the painful stiffness in my joints. I scooped his trembling head into my lap, my hands becoming stained with warm blood. He had always been a deeply curious dog, prone to eating anything he found on the floor. In a terrifying flash of realization, I looked toward the living room, the area right beneath the antique sofa. I did not waste a second calling for Victoria, who was still sleeping upstairs. Adrenaline fueled by pure panic temporarily burned away the heavy fog in my brain. I lifted Duke's limp body into my arms, staggering out the front door and throwing him into the back seat of my car. I broke every speed limit driving to the emergency clinic. I carried Duke through the sliding glass doors, yelling for immediate medical assistance. The veterinary staff rushed him straight into the trauma unit, leaving me standing alone in the brightly lit waiting room, my hands and shirt covered in dark blood. I paced the floor for 2 agonizing hours. Finally, the lead emergency veterinarian walked through the swinging doors, her face set in a grim, serious expression. She asked me to follow her into a private consultation room. "We stabilized him, Mr. Caldwell," she said quietly, taking a seat. But it was incredibly close. Duke suffered a massive internal hemorrhage. His blood completely lost the ability to clot. We had to administer emergency plasma transfusions and coagulants to keep him alive. I let out a shaky breath, rubbing my blood-stained hands over my face. "What caused it?" I asked, my voice barely a hoarse whisper. Did he eat something toxic in the yard? The veterinarian shook her head, pulling up a toxicology report. This was not a standard canine poison, she explained. We ran a chemical panel on his blood and stomach contents. Duke ingested a massive concentrated dose of a synthetic anticoagulant. It is an extremely powerful, untraceable blood thinner, typically prescribed for severe human cardiovascular conditions. She paused. The dosage he ingested was absolutely astronomical. It was enough to cause immediate internal bleeding and organ failure. If you had brought him in 20 minutes later, he would have bled out internally. Do you have any heart medication in your home that he could have accessed? The sterile walls of the small clinic room seemed to violently close in around me. My mind raced back to earlier that evening. The inexplicable brain fog, the sudden dizziness, the white capsule slipping through my fingers and rolling directly under the sofa. The exact spot where Duke always loved to sleep. Victoria had not just been managing my health. She had been actively, systematically poisoning me. The medication she handed me every single night was not designed to regulate my heart rate. It was a lethal blood thinner designed to slowly and quietly cause a massive, seemingly natural internal hemorrhage. She was deliberately destroying my physical and cognitive health, paving the flawless path for Preston to steal my firm. I sat in the hard plastic chair of the veterinary clinic, staring blankly at the white linoleum floor. The heavy fog that had clouded my brain for weeks was instantly incinerated by a blinding white-hot fury. The devastating truth solidified into undeniable fact. My beautiful, loving wife was actually a cold, highly calculating murderer. My breathing slowed, becoming incredibly deep and measured. The weak, confused, and sickly 70-year-old man who had walked into this clinic an hour ago was completely dead. That pathetic, vulnerable version of Harrison Caldwell had been murdered by his own family. As I stood up to pay the medical bill, my mind snapped back to a state of razor-sharp, merciless clarity. "The sick old man dies tonight," I whispered into the quiet, sterile room. "The hunter awakens." I walked out of the veterinary clinic and into the cold night air, leaving the weak, confused version of myself dead on the linoleum floor. When I arrived back at the estate, the house was completely silent. I crept upstairs to my master bathroom, locked the door, and retrieved the small amber bottle from the medicine cabinet. I twisted the cap off and watched the white capsules tumble into the porcelain sink. I turned the brass faucet, letting the rushing water wash the synthetic poison down the drain. I replaced them with benign vitamin supplements of the exact same shape and color. The next morning, Victoria handed me the swapped capsule with her usual, sickeningly sweet smile. I swallowed the harmless vitamin with my tea, maintaining my posture of a broken, dying man. The physical withdrawal from the heavy blood thinner was agonizing. For the first 2 days, my body ached, and my joints throbbed with a dull, persistent fire. My heart hammered irregularly as it desperately fought to recalibrate its natural rhythm without the interference of the toxic chemicals. I spent hours lying in bed staring at the ceiling, enduring the silent physical torture, while plotting my ultimate revenge against them both. By the third morning, the suffocating chemical cloud completely lifted from my mind. The heavy brain fog evaporated, replaced by a razor-sharp crystalline clarity. My physical strength returned with a sudden surging intensity. I could feel the blood pumping cleanly through my veins. The dizziness vanished, and my hands stopped trembling. I felt like a man who had just forcefully crawled out of his own grave. But I knew that if Victoria or Preston noticed even a fraction of a percentage of my rapid recovery, they would immediately change their tactics and find a faster, more violent way to finish me. I had to become the ultimate actor in a play designed for an audience of 2. To give my enemies absolute, unquestionable false confidence, I decided to act sicker than I ever had before. I began to deliberately stumble when walking down the grand staircase, gripping the mahogany banister with white knuckles and taking slow, agonizing steps. I forced my hands to shake violently whenever I picked up a coffee cup, deliberately spilling hot liquid onto the expensive carpets. I dragged my left foot, slightly mimicking the classic terrifying early warning signs of an impending catastrophic neurological event. I escalated the performance by feigning severe, debilitating memory loss. During our evening dinners, I would suddenly stop speaking in the middle of a sentence, letting my eyes glaze over as I stared blankly at the wall. I intentionally slurred my words, turning simple requests into confused, disjointed babble. I asked Victoria the same mundane questions 3 or 4 times an hour, watching her eyes flash with a mixture of profound annoyance and deep victorious satisfaction. She would sigh dramatically, pat my hand condescendingly, and speak to me as if I were a lost, heavily medicated toddler. My deliberate display of rapid cognitive decline gave Preston the exact ammunition he needed to aggressively advance his timeline. The following week, he requested a private meeting in my home study. He arrived carrying a thick leather binder, his face twisted into a mask of deep manufactured sorrow. Victoria stood closely beside him, resting a comforting hand on his shoulder. Preston spoke in a hushed, reverent tone, gently suggesting that my health was failing far too quickly for me to safely manage the complex daily operations of the firm. He insisted it was time to step away entirely. He opened the leather binder and slowly slid a dense legal document across the surface of my desk. It was a comprehensive temporary power of attorney. This document would officially hand Preston absolute, uncontested control over the entire corporate infrastructure. It granted him the sole authority to execute large-scale financial transfers, sign binding federal contracts, and manage all client portfolios without requiring my secondary authorization. It was the final key to my kingdom, completely removing the last remaining administrative hurdles blocking his massive money laundering operation. He handed me a gold pen, his eyes pleading with fake concern. I looked down at the document, forcing my hand to tremble violently as I reached for the pen. I hesitated, looking up at Victoria with wide, artificially confused eyes. I asked her if she truly thought this was the right decision. She leaned down, kissing my forehead softly, and whispered that Preston only wanted to protect our family legacy so I could finally rest. I let out a long, ragged sigh, grasped the pen tightly, and scrawled a shaky, barely legible signature across the bottom of the page. The trap was now fully armed and heavily baited. The moment the ink dried on the thick paper, a palpable wave of intense relief washed over both of them. Preston carefully retrieved the document, sliding it back into his leather binder with a smug, triumphant efficiency. He thanked me profusely, promising that he would make me incredibly proud. As they walked out of my study, I deliberately let my head fall forward onto the desk, pretending to be completely exhausted by the simple act of signing my name. Through the heavy oak doors, I could hear their footsteps retreating down the hallway toward the massive kitchen. I silently lifted my head from the desk and moved quietly toward the slightly ajar door, listening intently. I could hear the distinct, cheerful popping of a champagne cork echoing from the kitchen island. Victoria and Preston were openly celebrating their flawless victory. I heard Victoria laugh, a sharp, cruel sound that bounced off the marble walls. She proudly declared that I was fading so incredibly fast that I would likely suffer a fatal, massive stroke before the end of the month. Preston confidently agreed, boasting that the firm would be entirely theirs within a matter of weeks. They were completely intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. They believed they had successfully outsmarted a titan of the financial world. They thought they had perfectly orchestrated the slow, invisible murder of a wealthy old man and legally stolen a $20 million empire without leaving a single trace of evidence. They drank their expensive champagne and toasted to their brilliant, wealthy future, completely unaware that the frail, dying man they were mocking was actually standing just a few feet away in the dark hallway, listening to every single word they spoke with absolute terrifying clarity. With the predators entirely distracted by the intoxicating thrill of their apparent victory, they completely dropped their guard. They stopped watching me closely, assuming I was nothing more than a harmless, medicated ghost wandering the halls of my own home. This gave me the exact operational freedom I desperately needed. I retreated silently to my dark study, locked the heavy doors, and booted up my encrypted secondary laptop. The real war was about to begin. I sat down in my chair and smiled coldly in the darkness. I opened a direct, heavily encrypted communication channel to my oldest, most trusted contacts within the powerful Federal Financial Crimes Division to successfully initiate my ultimate master plan. I sent the encrypted transmission into the federal dark web, a silent digital flare signaling to my former colleagues that the ghost auditor was finally coming out of retirement. The response was immediate, confirming my secure channels were active and my clearance was intact. I closed the laptop, letting the screen fade to black, and mentally prepared for the final performance I would give inside this house. The following morning, I dragged myself down the grand staircase, making sure my footing was visibly unsteady. Victoria was in the kitchen humming a cheerful tune as she poured fresh coffee. I slumped heavily onto a bar stool, rubbing my face with shaking hands. I looked up at her, letting my eyes appear hollow and defeated. "Victoria," I muttered, my voice perfectly capturing the raspy, broken tone of a man overwhelmed by his own mortality. "I need to get away. I need to leave the city. My mind is completely exhausted, and the stress is making my heart race constantly. I want to take a solo trip to the old fishing cabin in Maine. I need a week entirely off the grid, surrounded by nature, just to clear my dying mind." Victoria paused, holding the coffee pot suspended in the air. For a fleeting second, I saw the raw calculation turning rapidly behind her beautiful eyes. A remote cabin in Maine meant I would be completely isolated, hundreds of miles away from the corporate headquarters, and entirely removed from the daily banking operations. It meant Preston would have absolute uninterrupted freedom to finalize the massive offshore laundering cycle without the slightest risk of me walking into his office. "Oh, my poor darling," she cooed quickly, setting the pot down and rushing over to wrap her arms around my shoulders. "That sounds like an absolutely wonderful idea. You have been pushing yourself far too hard. The mountain air and the quiet will do wonders for your blood pressure. Are you sure you want to make the long drive alone?" I nodded weakly, leaning into her touch. "I need solitude," I whispered. "Just me in the woods." Victoria immediately sprang into action. She was practically vibrating with barely contained excitement as she rushed upstairs to pack my bags. She carefully packed my warmest sweaters, my heavy boots, and most importantly, a freshly restocked bottle of my toxic heart medication. She wanted me isolated, medicated, and completely out of the way. An hour later, my bags were loaded into the trunk of my luxury sedan. Victoria stood on the front steps of the estate, wrapped in an elegant cashmere shawl, waving a fond, loving goodbye. Preston had already left for the firm, eager to utilize the new temporary power of attorney I had foolishly signed the day before. As I pulled out of the long manicured driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Victoria had already dropped her hand, turned her back, and was walking briskly back into the house, pulling out her phone to alert her son. I drove carefully through the wealthy suburbs of Virginia, maintaining the slow, overly cautious speed of a highly medicated elderly driver. I kept my posture slightly hunched, aware that the luxury vehicle was equipped with an internal dash camera and a sophisticated GPS tracking module. I drove steadily northward for nearly 3 hours, meticulously following the primary interstate route toward New England. When I finally reached a massive, bustling commercial truck stop just outside of Baltimore, I pulled off the busy highway. The sprawling asphalt parking lot was incredibly crowded with heavy 18-wheelers, loud rumbling diesel engines, and hundreds of anonymous, weary travelers. It was the perfect environment for an invisible ghost to successfully vanish without a trace. I parked my luxury sedan in a dark, dirty blind spot between two massive shipping trailers, completely obscuring the vehicle from the main security surveillance cameras. I turned off the engine and sat perfectly still for a quiet moment. Then I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved my expensive smartphone. I knew Preston had likely installed hidden tracking software on the device to monitor my location. I powered it down, removed the small internal SIM card, and snapped the delicate plastic chip cleanly in half. I stepped out of the car, walked over to a heavy metal industrial dumpster, and buried the broken phone deep beneath layers of rotting trash. I retrieved only a small, nondescript black duffel bag from the trunk of my car, deliberately leaving the carefully packed suitcases and the lethal bottle of white pills sitting uselessly on the front passenger seat. They could actively track the luxury sedan all they wanted. It would remain parked in this anonymous, filthy lot until the internal battery completely died. I walked briskly across the massive truck stop, my physical posture straightening completely. The fake trembling in my hands was entirely gone. The sluggish, shuffling gait was instantly replaced by the confident, purposeful stride of a seasoned federal financial operative. I walked directly toward the far end of the service road, where a dusty, incredibly plain silver sedan was waiting quietly by the edge of the dense tree line. I had arranged the secondary vehicle entirely in cash, utilizing a highly secure, untraceable contact I had maintained from my previous days working covertly for the Department of Justice. The keys were tucked securely behind the front tire. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the quiet engine, and immediately turned the vehicle south. I was absolutely not going to a remote fishing cabin in Maine. I was heading directly into the beating political heart of Washington District of Columbia. The drive took less than an hour, but every passing mile felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating layer of toxic skin. I navigated the busy streets with practiced ease, blending seamlessly into the chaotic afternoon traffic. I finally pulled into the underground parking garage of an older, highly secure hotel located just blocks away from the main federal judicial buildings. It was a brutalist structure designed explicitly for absolute discretion. I bypassed the main lobby completely using a secure service elevator to access the 7th floor. I swiped a pre-programmed magnetic key card and stepped into a dimly lit, quiet corner suite. The heavy blackout curtains were tightly drawn, shielding the room from the bustling city outside. I dropped my duffel bag onto the carpet and walked directly to the heavy oak desk sitting in the corner. I unzipped the top compartment of the bag and pulled out a thick, military-grade encrypted laptop. This was not the standard, easily monitored corporate machine Preston controlled. This was my personal, devastating arsenal. I sat down in the heavy leather chair, flipping the sturdy screen open. The keyboard glowed with a cool, sharp light in the dark room. I placed my hands over the keys, feeling the familiar, deeply comforting thrill of the hunt coursing rapidly through my veins. The senile, broken old man who had blindly allowed his family to rob him was officially dead. I typed in my complex alphanumeric password, preparing to completely unleash my true identity and systematically tear their stolen financial empire entirely to the ground. The incredibly heavy custom-designed encryption software booted up with a silent, glowing confirmation on my screen. For 40 years, the world knew Harrison Caldwell as a conservative, highly successful wealth manager catering to the elite circles of Virginia and Washington. My immediate family, my corporate colleagues, and my closest personal friends firmly believed I spent my days analyzing municipal bonds, attending tedious board meetings, and carefully balancing geriatric retirement portfolios. They simply saw a quiet, profoundly predictable man who thrived on strict routine, unwavering discipline, and absolute financial stability. They had absolutely no idea that for the last 15 years, my public persona was nothing more than an elaborate, highly sanctioned facade. I was a primary ghost auditor for the United States Department of Justice. The title was an unofficial designation, a highly classified operational role granted only to a select handful of elite financial experts operating completely off the grid. My actual job was to actively hunt down international money laundering syndicates, trace invisible offshore corporate structures, and dismantle global financial terror networks from the inside out. My pristine, deeply respected private wealth management firm provided the absolute perfect, impenetrable operational cover. It granted me legitimate, completely unquestioned access to the absolute highest echelons of international banking without ever raising a single red flag with suspicious foreign entities. I spent my days politely smiling at country club luncheons, shaking hands with wealthy elites, and my nights quietly tearing apart the encrypted financial arteries of the most dangerous violent cartels on the entire planet. Preston sincerely thought he had brilliantly outsmarted a tired, senile old man. He firmly believed his rudimentary knowledge of European accounting software and off-the-shelf encryption protocols was enough to completely lock me out of my own proprietary servers. He was a greedy, arrogant child carelessly playing with matches inside a heavily loaded powder keg. When I originally built the digital infrastructure for my massive firm, I specifically designed it to serve as a deeply secure conduit for active federal investigations. Every single server, every firewall, and every external routing protocol contained deeply buried federal-grade backdoor access points. These highly specialized backdoors were completely invisible to standard diagnostic sweeps and virtually immune to commercial cybersecurity defenses. I did not just own the house Preston was currently trying to brazenly steal. I had personally poured the concrete foundation and meticulously wired the invisible alarm systems. I typed a rapid sequence of complex alphanumeric command codes into my terminal, deliberately bypassing the standard graphical user interface entirely. I absolutely did not need his stolen elementary administrative passwords to regain total control. I was dropping directly through the digital ceiling, bypassing every single trap he thought he had so cleverly set. The heavy laptop screen flashed a brilliant stark white as my powerful override commands brutally punched right through the artificial security barricades. I watched with grim, intense satisfaction as his newly installed commercial firewalls collapsed instantly, registering absolutely zero internal intrusion alerts on his end. To Preston and his accomplices, his system would currently show a state of absolute undisturbed normalcy. To me, the entire corporate network laid itself completely bare, totally stripped of all its protective digital layers. I seamlessly navigated directly into the central holding ledger, instantly bypassing the visual dashboard glitch he had so proudly manufactured to deliberately hide his massive theft. I was now directly inside the raw, unfiltered transaction history of the firm. I quickly initiated a targeted, highly aggressive data extraction protocol. I specifically instructed the federal software to pull every single internal communication, every deleted client file, and every international wire transfer authorized within the past 12 months. The sheer volume of raw data Preston had carelessly generated in his arrogant, unchecked frenzy was truly staggering, and I was going to methodically capture every single byte of it before the sun came up. But digital forensic evidence was only one half of the complex equation required to secure a permanent conviction. To entirely dismantle their operation and ensure they both faced maximum unyielding federal prosecution, I desperately needed undeniable physical proof of their direct premeditated conspiracy. I needed to seamlessly capture their actual voices, their raw unscripted admissions of guilt, in a completely unfiltered domestic environment. Before I left the sprawling estate this morning, carefully playing the pathetic role of the heavily medicated, completely exhausted patriarch, I had made one final crucial preparation in our grand living room. While Victoria was upstairs, happily packing my bags for the fake trip to Maine, completely intoxicated by the thrilling prospect of my imminent departure, I had acted swiftly. I had slipped a microscopic, military-grade audio transmitter directly beneath the plush fabric of her favorite antique armchair. It was a highly sophisticated piece of surveillance equipment I had quietly retained from my active field operations. It was designed to remain entirely dormant, emitting zero electronic signals until it successfully received a specific, highly encrypted remote activation ping. I opened a secondary, heavily secured application on my laptop, pulling up a specialized frequency interface used exclusively for covert remote surveillance. I slowly and carefully typed the 12-digit alphanumeric activation key and confidently pressed Enter. A small pulsing green indicator light immediately appeared in the top right corner of my dark screen, successfully confirming a stable digital handshake with the microscopic transmitter hidden miles away in my Alexandria living room. I reached down into my black duffel bag, retrieved a pair of heavy noise-canceling tactical headphones, and slid them securely over my ears. The initial burst of electronic static was incredibly brief, quickly giving way to the crystal-clear, deeply familiar ambient acoustic signature of my own house. I could clearly hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the main hallway. I could hear the subtle, continuous hum of the central air conditioning unit, pushing cool air through the massive estate. And then, cutting sharply through the silence, I heard the distinct, unmistakable clinking of crystal glasses. My primary monitor suddenly exploded with chaotic, relentless digital activity. The highly targeted data extraction protocol completed its initial aggressive sweep, and thousands of highly classified documents began rapidly flooding my screen in a cascading, overwhelming waterfall of pure, undeniable, and staggering guilt. Endless rows of shadowy illicit offshore routing numbers, tragically deleted pensioner portfolios, and blatantly falsified corporate memos materialized brightly before my eyes. The absolute digital proof of his massive, unforgivable financial betrayal was entirely absolute, deeply sickening, and profoundly overwhelming. At the exact same terrifying moment, the live audio feed buzzing continuously in my heavy headphones crackled sharply to life. The heavy, ornate wooden doors of the living room swung forcefully open with a loud thud. The sharp, sickening sound of her triumphant, echoing laughter completely filled my ears, closely followed by his incredibly arrogant, booming, deeply confident voice. They were cheerfully pouring another full round of incredibly expensive imported champagne, completely oblivious to the highly dangerous fact that the invisible ghost auditor was now actively listening to them. The devastating truth of their murderous, greedy conspiracy was about to violently hit me with the incredibly destructive, unstoppable force of a massive, runaway freight train. The blinding cascade of digital information scrolling rapidly across my heavy encrypted monitor demanded my absolute undivided attention. I forced myself to briefly tune out the sounds of Victoria and Preston clinking their glasses on the live audio feed. I needed to meticulously dissect the raw financial data Preston had so carelessly generated. I initiated a deep structural analysis of the corrupted ledger files. My highly specialized federal software effortlessly peeled back the fragile layers of Preston's amateur digital camouflage. The initial $2 million I had previously traced through Arthur Pendleton's liquidated portfolio was not the entirety of the theft. It was merely the very tip of a colossal, incredibly dangerous financial iceberg. His actions were infinitely more sinister than I calculated, reaching far beyond simple corporate embezzlement. As my custom diagnostic tools aggressively cross-referenced the hidden routing numbers against classified federal databases, a horrifying, undeniable pattern immediately emerged. Preston was not just a greedy corporate thief casually stealing from vulnerable elderly clients to fund his lavish lifestyle. He had actively transformed my pristine, deeply respected wealth management firm into a highly efficient, fully operational washing machine for a ruthless international narcotics cartel. The pristine reputation I had cultivated for 4 decades was currently providing cover for the most dangerous criminals on the planet. The sheer scale of his reckless, unforgivable criminality was absolutely breathtaking. I watched in grim, silent horror as the screen illuminated a complex web of rapid consecutive wire transfers originating from notorious shadow banks located in the Cayman Islands and the Republic of Panama. Over $15 million of incredibly dirty, blood-soaked cartel money had been systematically funneled directly into our primary corporate holding accounts over the past 9 months. Preston had specifically weaponized the legitimate, highly stable pensioner funds of my oldest, most trusting clients to wash the illicit capital completely clean. He was burying the cartel cash deep within massive bundles of legitimate municipal bonds and standard retirement dividends. He would briefly commingle the dirty money with the clean, untouchable life savings of innocent people like Arthur Pendleton, creating a perfectly blended, untraceable financial soup. Days later, he would extract the principal amount, routing the legitimate corporate funds back out to seemingly harmless shell companies, registered under fictitious corporate entities. The money went in carrying the dark, violent stain of global narcotics trafficking, and it came out wearing the pristine, highly respected badge of Harrison Caldwell Wealth Management. He utilized our secure banking channels as a perfect shield to completely obscure the origin of these massive illegal deposits. But Preston was not performing this highly illegal service out of fear or coercion. The financial ledgers clearly revealed his true, unadulterated motivation. For every transaction he processed for the cartel, he was actively skimming a massive, incredibly dangerous 20% commission directly off the top. He was effectively stealing millions of dollars from some of the most violent, unforgiving criminals on the entire planet. That staggering, illicit commission was the true source of his sudden, inexplicable wealth. It paid for the metallic black European sports car sitting in the executive parking lot. It funded the massive custom diamond necklace he had draped so proudly across Monica's collarbone. He was happily parading his illegal blood-soaked profits in front of the world, completely oblivious to the catastrophic danger he had invited directly into our lives. A cold, paralyzing dread completely washed over my body as the true magnitude of his profound stupidity settled heavily into my bones. Preston firmly believed he was a brilliant, untouchable financial mastermind, simply outsmarting the global banking system. He had absolutely no idea how incredibly fragile his position truly was. International narcotics cartels do not possess an ounce of mercy for amateur corporate accountants who skim from their primary laundering operations. They do not file civil lawsuits or politely demand corporate arbitration when they discover a severe discrepancy in their operational ledgers. They send highly trained, utterly ruthless enforcement squads to completely eradicate the problem. By aggressively funneling their dirty money through my personal corporate accounts and brazenly stealing a massive 20% cut, Preston had effectively painted a giant glowing target directly onto the back of our entire family. If the cartel auditors discovered his massive theft before the federal authorities raided our corporate headquarters, they would not simply execute Preston in a dark alley. They would systematically hunt down and violently murder every single person connected to the missing capital. They would tear through my firm, destroy my legacy, and eliminate anyone who could expose their financial network. Preston had recklessly invited wolves directly into the sheep pen, blindly believing he was clever enough to control them. I sat perfectly still in the dim, heavily secured downtown hotel room, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of this terrifying realization pressing down on my chest. I desperately had to permanently dismantle his entire criminal infrastructure immediately, not just to salvage the remaining assets of my innocent clients, but to prevent an inevitable, truly horrifying wave of absolute catastrophic violence from washing completely over us and destroying everything we possessed. My fingers flew rapidly across the illuminated keyboard, successfully securing absolute ironclad digital copies of the catastrophic cartel ledgers. I meticulously and carefully packaged the damning, undeniable physical evidence into highly encrypted federal data packets, preparing to safely forward the entire terrifying portfolio directly to my trusted contacts at the Department of Justice. The financial data alone was more than enough to secure multiple consecutive life sentences for Preston in a desolate, unforgiving maximum security federal penitentiary. With the digital extraction successfully nearing completion, I finally allowed my complete undivided attention to slowly drift back to the live acoustic feed buzzing continuously in my heavy tactical headphones. The background noise of the Alexandria estate was incredibly clear. I could hear the subtle clinking of the expensive crystal flutes as Victoria and Preston continued their joyful, arrogant celebration in the grand living room. I reached out and gently adjusted the frequency dial on my audio interface, deliberately isolating their specific vocal patterns to completely eliminate the ambient background interference. Every single syllable they uttered resonated with a chilling, sickening clarity, transporting me right back into the very house I had just fled. The incredibly damning financial data, glowing brightly on my laptop screen, was bad enough representing a massive, unprecedented corporate betrayal that threatened to completely destroy my carefully constructed 40-year professional legacy. But as their unscripted, highly guarded private conversation began to flow clearly through the heavy headphones, the atmosphere in the dark room suddenly shifted. The casual, triumphant tone of their celebration slowly morphed into something far more sinister, deeply terrifying, and profoundly disturbing. They were no longer simply discussing the future of the firm, the fake cryptocurrency investments, or the impending absolute success of their massive corporate theft. The chilling conversation took a sudden, incredibly sharp turn toward a much darker, much older, carefully buried secret. I leaned forward in my heavy leather chair, closing my eyes and holding my breath as the terrifying audio feed began to reveal a deeply personal, fundamentally shattering betrayal that completely eclipsed the $15 million of laundered cartel cash. The heavy tactical headphones pressed tightly against my ears, sealing out the muted hum of the Washington traffic below. Through the encrypted audio feed, the ambient sounds of my own living room materialized with terrifying clarity. I could hear the sharp, distinct clink of crystal glasses meeting in a celebratory toast. Liquid splashed softly as another bottle of vintage champagne was uncorked. Monica let out a high melodic laugh, the sound grating against my nerves like shattered glass. They were entirely relaxed, completely unburdened by the staggering magnitude of the crimes they were actively committing. I sat frozen in the dimly lit hotel suite, staring at the cascading lines of cartel data on my monitor, while the voices of my family filled my head. To absent friends, Preston declared, his voice dripping with a thick, arrogant sarcasm. He took a long sip, exhaling with deep satisfaction, and to the incredible, uninterrupted peace and quiet of the estate, Victoria chuckled softly from her favorite antique armchair, the exact location where I had planted the microscopic transmitter just hours earlier. He barely made it out the door without tripping over his own feet. She mocked her tone, completely devoid of the suffocating, fake sympathy she had weaponized for weeks. The drive to Maine will completely exhaust whatever is left of his failing heart. We have the entire week to finalize the transition without him asking those repetitive, senile questions. Monica chimed in, her voice hushed with greedy anticipation. Are you absolutely certain the final transfers are secure, Preston? I saw the new balance in the offshore account today, and it made my hands shake. What if the banking regulators start asking questions about those massive deposits? Preston let out a loud, dismissive scoff. My son, the man I had raised, educated, and trusted with my professional legacy, paced across the hardwood floor. I could hear the confident strike of his expensive leather shoes. You worry entirely too much, my beautiful wife, Preston stated smoothly. I did not just stumble into this arrangement. I built an absolutely flawless, impenetrable corporate shield. The cartel auditors have already verified the clean return wires. They are perfectly happy. And the federal banking regulators will not look twice at the incoming capital because of how I structured the intake. But the true genius of my design is not how I moved the money. It is who officially moved the money. I gripped the edge of the heavy oak desk, my knuckles turning stark white. What do you mean by that? Victoria asked, the gentle clinking of her glass pausing. Preston stopped pacing. I could picture him standing by the grand fireplace, swirling his champagne, completely enamored with his own perceived brilliance. I isolated the primary corporate administrative server 3 months ago, he explained, his voice swelling with dark pride. I completely bypassed the secondary authentication protocols. I did not just use my own credentials to facilitate the cartel washes. I digitally extracted Harrison's encrypted master signature. I stamped his personal, verified authorization seal on every single document. A cold, hollow void opened in the center of my chest. Every single shell company registration, every offshore wire transfer, every heavily disguised cartel contract bears his exact digital fingerprint, Preston boasted, laughing darkly at his own treachery. Legally speaking, I am nothing more than a mid-level corporate officer executing the explicit documented directives of the founding partner. Harrison Caldwell is the sole mastermind behind the entire laundering operation on paper. Monica gasped softly, a sound of thrilled, horrific realization. You forged his signature on everything. But what happens when the money is fully washed and the cartel cuts ties? What happens when the federal agents inevitably follow the breadcrumbs? That is the absolute best part of the plan, Preston replied, the cruelty in his voice echoing through my headphones. We do not have to wait for the federal agents to stumble upon the breadcrumbs. I am going to hand-deliver the entire bakery directly to them. My breath caught in my throat. I stared blankly at the glowing monitor, the raw financial data suddenly taking on a much darker, much more lethal context. Once the final $15 million wash clears our primary holding accounts this Friday, my work for the cartel is completely finished, Preston continued, his tone cold and calculating. I have already drafted a highly detailed, completely anonymous tip to the Financial Crimes Divisions of the local federal field office. I included encrypted fragments of the ledgers, just enough to trigger a massive, unavoidable criminal investigation. Victoria let out a sharp intake of breath. You are going to intentionally invite the federal authorities into our firm. Into his firm, mother, Preston corrected sharply. Yes, I am. Because when the federal agents kick down the corporate doors with their warrants, they will seize the servers and find Harrison's signature on every single illegal transaction. They will trace the stolen funds from those pathetic elderly pensioners directly to the cartel accounts, and all the physical evidence will point squarely at the old man sitting at the top of the pyramid. He paused, letting the devastating weight of his masterstroke settle over the room. I will step forward as the shocked, horrified son who blindly trusted his father. I will cooperate fully with the authorities. I will hand over the temporary power of attorney he just signed, proving he was desperately trying to shift blame as his health failed. The media will completely devour the story of the corrupt, greedy wealth manager who stole from his clients to fund narcotics trafficking. Harrison will take the absolute maximum fall. He will be indicted, convicted, and sentenced before he even understands what hit him. He will rot in a maximum security federal penitentiary for the next 20 years, and he will die behind bars. We walk away entirely clean, keeping the millions I skimmed off the top completely immune from any legal fallout. The sheer, unadulterated evil of his grand design paralyzed me. My own son had not just stolen from me. He had not just jeopardized my life by inviting cartel money into my firm. He had meticulously orchestrated a complex, inescapable legal trap designed to end my life in a concrete cell. He was going to use the federal justice system, the very institution I had secretly served for 15 years, as the murder weapon to eliminate me. The irony was so dark, so incredibly profound, that I felt physically sick. I sat in the dark hotel room, my hands shaking with a violent, unrestrained fury. I was a ghost auditor. I hunted monsters for a living. Yet the most dangerous, soulless predator I had ever encountered was the boy I had raised in my own home. For a long moment, the audio feed transmitted only the soft clinking of fresh drinks. Then Victoria suddenly cleared her throat, bringing a chilling, absolute silence to the living room. Her voice sliced through the feed like a knife carrying an icy tone that instantly shattered their confident celebration. I stopped breathing as she began to speak, revealing a darker, deeply personal truth we had all somehow entirely failed to see. The sharp clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. Victoria's voice pierced the sudden quiet of the grand living room, completely devoid of the suffocating warmth she usually projected in public. It was a sound stripped down to its bare metallic core, echoing with a chilling, predatory focus that made my blood run completely cold. You are incredibly proud of your little federal framing project. Preston, Victoria said, her words carefully, measured, and dripping with absolute condescension. But you are completely missing the fundamental, fatal flaw in your grand design. Harrison is a natural fighter. He always has been. If you let the federal authorities arrest him while he is still breathing, he will hire the absolute best defense attorneys in Washington. He will painstakingly tear your digital breadcrumbs apart in a federal courtroom. He will undoubtedly expose your cartel connections to save himself. We simply cannot leave this to chance. I heard Preston shift uncomfortably on the expensive leather upholstery. The evidence is insurmountable, Mother, he argued defensively. He will not be able to defend against his own digital signature. You severely underestimate his resilience, Victoria snapped back sharply. I have been watching him incredibly closely for weeks. The synthetic blood thinners are simply taking far too long to finish the job. His cardiovascular system is far more stubborn than the doctors predicted. He stumbled and fumbled his pill the other day, and even though I quickly replaced it, the overall physical decline is painfully slow. We do not have the luxury of waiting for his heart to naturally give out under the mounting stress of a federal indictment. I am entirely tired of playing the devoted, grieving wife. I want this finished now. Monica's voice trembled slightly through the audio feed, though not out of fear, but out of a dark, morbid curiosity. "What exactly are you suggesting, Victoria?" she asked. "I am not suggesting anything," Monica Victoria replied smoothly, the distinct sound of liquid pouring into her crystal glass, providing a sickening soundtrack to her words. "I am stating exactly what is going to happen. When Harrison returns from his pathetic little fishing cabin retreat in Maine next week, I am ending this permanently. I have successfully acquired a highly concentrated, incredibly fast-acting liquid derivative of the anticoagulant. It is virtually undetectable in a standard autopsy and completely lethal in a single elevated dose. I will mix it directly into his evening tea the very night he walks through the front door." A profound, icy numbness spread rapidly from my chest outward, freezing the blood in my veins. I sat rigid in my secure hotel suite, the heavy tactical headphones pressing the terrifying reality of my impending murder directly into my skull. "It will be incredibly swift," Victoria continued, her tone as casually dismissive as if she were discussing a dinner menu. "The massive influx of the chemical will trigger a catastrophic internal hemorrhage within hours. By the time the sun comes up, he will suffer a fatal, completely irreversible stroke. His brain will essentially drown in its own blood. It will look exactly like the tragic natural end of an elderly, highly stressed man whose failing body simply could not handle the immense corporate pressure. And your federal trap," she said, addressing Preston directly, "will serve as the absolute perfect secondary narrative. When the agents inevitably raid the firm and freeze the corporate assets based on your anonymous tip, they will find a dead man. The state cannot prosecute a corpse, Preston. The federal authorities will officially drop the criminal charges due to the untimely death of the primary suspect. They will close the file, completely satisfied that the corrupt mastermind suffered a fatal stroke just as his empire was collapsing around him. The sheer brilliance of her horrific logic struck me like a physical blow. She was not merely murdering me for convenience. She was utilizing my brutal death to permanently seal Preston's corporate theft. "But what about the estate, Victoria?" Preston asked, his voice losing its typical arrogance, completely giving way to a greedy, breathless awe. "If the federal agents seize the corporate accounts, our access to his personal capital might be indefinitely delayed." Victoria let out a soft, venomous laugh that chilled me to the bone. "That is precisely why he needs to die before the federal raid is fully executed. You are completely forgetting the ironclad structure of his personal life insurance policies and the primary family trust. I have spent the last decade meticulously reviewing his estate planning. The exact moment Harrison is declared legally dead, the primary life insurance policy triggers an automatic, uncontested payout of $10 million directly to me as his surviving spouse. The secondary corporate trust releases another $10 million in unrestricted liquid assets. $20 million, Preston. Completely clean, completely legal, and entirely beyond the reach of any federal asset forfeiture tied to your cartel operations." $20 million, Monica repeated breathlessly, the sheer unadulterated greed heavily intoxicating her words. "Plus the $15 million you washed for the cartel. We will be incredibly wealthy." "Exactly," Victoria murmured softly. "But the execution must be absolutely flawless. We cannot afford a single mistake. The moment he takes his final breath, we must maintain total composure." "The medicine bottles," Monica interjected, her voice suddenly sharp and incredibly eager to participate in the gruesome planning. I could hear the rustle of her adjusting her posture on the sofa. "We have to completely destroy the remaining medicine bottles before we call emergency services. If the paramedics arrive and secure the scene, they might catalog his current prescriptions. If the medical examiner notices a discrepancy between his prescribed dosage and the actual chemical levels in his blood, they might order a full forensic autopsy." "Very astute." Monica Victoria praised, her tone sickeningly maternal and proud. "The moment Harrison collapses, before I even touch the telephone to dial emergency services, I will gather every single bottle of the blood thinners from his master bathroom. I will dump the capsules down the garbage disposal and thoroughly wash the plastic containers with bleach. You and Preston will be here to support me. We will be the devastated, grieving family, desperately trying to revive our beloved, fallen patriarch. It is brilliant. Preston agreed, his voice dripping with dark admiration. The perfect crime. The old man takes the fall for the cartel, his death closes the federal investigation, and his life insurance directly funds our permanent escape. To Harrison, Victoria toasted softly, the sound of crystal clinking once again echoing clearly through my heavy headphones. May his final days in the dark woods be peaceful, because his return will be anything but. I reached up with trembling fingers and slowly pulled the tactical headphones away from my ears, severing the live audio feed. The sudden silence of the secure hotel suite was deafening. I placed the headphones carefully on the heavy oak desk, staring blankly at the glowing monitor. The cascading rows of illegal financial data were still quietly compiling in the background, but they no longer held my primary focus: the people I had loved. The family I had spent 4 decades working tirelessly to protect and provide for had methodically plotted my absolute destruction. They had sat comfortably in the grand living room I paid for, drinking the expensive champagne I bought, and cheerfully calculated the exact timeline of my violent death. They intended to completely ruin my professional name, steal my life's work to appease a ruthless narcotics cartel, and murder me in cold blood to collect a $20 million payout. A deep primal shift occurred within my soul. The shock and the profound heartbreak were instantly incinerated, replaced by a cold, terrifyingly calm resolve. I had spent 15 years as a senior ghost auditor, hunting the most dangerous financial predators on Earth. I had brought down massive international syndicates and completely dismantled cartels without ever revealing my face. I had always kept my 2 lives entirely separate to protect them, but my family had just completely and violently forced those 2 worlds to collide. I reached out and pressed the heavy power button on the encrypted laptop. The bright screen immediately faded to black, plunging the room into absolute darkness. I stood up from the leather chair, my posture perfectly straight, my mind operating with a ruthless, calculated precision. They believed they were hunting a sick, defenseless old man. They had absolutely no idea they had just declared war on a ghost. The time for hiding was officially over. Whatever Victoria was about to confess was abruptly cut off by the harsh metallic screech of a heavy chair violently dragging across a raw concrete floor. The terrifying memory of that chilling audio feed in my dark hotel room evaporated instantly as my mind violently snapped back to the cold, stark reality of the present moment. I was no longer sitting in the safety of a secure suite in Washington. I was sitting in a bleak, windowless interrogation room deep inside the local county precinct. My wrists were bound tightly together, secured to a heavy steel ring, bolted directly into the center of a scratched, dented aluminum table. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, sickly shadows across the barren gray walls. Across the table sat Detective Miller, a young, intensely arrogant local investigator who clearly believed he had just captured the ultimate criminal mastermind. He was leaning back in his chair, a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. In his right hand, he casually twirled a thick manila folder. I knew exactly what was inside that folder. It contained the highly detailed, flawlessly fabricated, anonymous tip that Preston had meticulously crafted and delivered to the local authorities. It held the forged offshore wire transfers, the fake corporate memos bearing my stolen digital signature, and a perfectly constructed narrative framing me as the sole architect of a massive cartel money laundering syndicate. "You have been playing the very dangerous game for a very long time, Mr. Caldwell," Detective Miller sneered, tossing the heavy folder onto the steel table with a loud theatrical slap. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the cold metal, trying to intimidate me with a hard, aggressive stare. "But the game is officially over. Your son came to us practically in tears, handing over everything. He bravely provided us with the exact blueprints of your entire illegal operation. We know about the millions of dollars you stole from your elderly clients. We know about the cartel connections. We have your signature on every single document. You are going to spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic life rotting in a maximum security federal prison." I sat perfectly still, my posture completely relaxed, despite the heavy steel cuffs biting into my wrists. I did not break eye contact. I did not offer a single word of defense or denial. My absolute silence only seemed to infuriate the young detective further. He wanted a confession. He wanted to break the wealthy, arrogant patriarch and secure a massive career-defining victory for himself. He had absolutely no idea that he had blindly walked into a trap that I had personally designed, authorized, and actively monitored for the past 2 weeks. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Miller continued, his voice rising in volume and frustration. "You think because you wear expensive tailored suits and live in a massive estate that the rules do not apply to you. But you left a massive, glaring paper trail, Harrison. You got greedy, sloppy, and careless. Your own flesh and blood could not stomach your incredible corruption anymore. Preston is a hero for exposing you." He stood up aggressively, his chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor once again. He walked over to the small, outdated computer terminal, resting on a secondary desk in the corner of the interrogation room. He cracked his knuckles loudly, preparing to officially log my arrest into the national database. "I am going to process your identification right now." He threatened, his fingers hovering over the dirty plastic keyboard. "Once your social security number enters the federal system, a permanent alert will be triggered across multiple law enforcement agencies. Every single bank account tied to your name will be instantly frozen. Your assets will be completely seized by the government. You will officially be a ward of the state by midnight." I watched him quietly, my breathing steady and calm. "Proceed, detective?" I finally said, my voice smooth, resonant, and completely devoid of fear. "Please enter my information into the federal database. I highly recommend you do exactly that." Miller glared at me, his face twisting into an ugly scowl. He scoffed loudly, dismissing my calm demeanor as the desperate, delusional bluff of a broken old man. He forcefully struck the keys rapidly, typing my full legal name, my date of birth, and my personal, highly classified 9-digit social security number into the standard local precinct booking software. He hit the enter key with a triumphant, aggressive flourish, clearly expecting the standard confirmation screen to populate with my local criminal profile. For exactly 3 seconds, the small computer monitor displayed a generic loading icon. Then the standard blue interface of the local police database abruptly vanished. The entire screen flashed a brilliant, blinding white before instantly turning a deep, violently saturated crimson red. A massive, high-decibel electronic alarm suddenly erupted from the computer speakers, echoing painfully off the bare concrete walls of the small interrogation room. The piercing siren was deafening, a relentless, shrieking warning designed to alert an entire facility to a critical, catastrophic system override. Detective Miller jumped back from the desk, his eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated panic. He frantically grabbed the computer mouse, violently clicking the buttons to close the window. The cursor was completely frozen. He slammed his fingers aggressively across the keyboard, desperately trying to abort the process, but the machine was entirely locked down. A large, stark black crest materialized in the very center of the glowing red monitor. It was the official, highly classified seal of the United States Department of Justice, specifically bearing the restricted insignia of the Federal Financial Crimes Division. A bold, incredibly stark message typed itself rapidly across the bottom of the screen in bold, undeniable capital letters. Warning. Classified federal operative identified. Unauthorized access of this specific profile is a direct violation of the National Security Act. This terminal has been locked and permanently secured by the Department of Justice. A designated federal extraction team has been successfully dispatched to your exact location. Maintain current holding position and await immediate federal intervention. The young detective stood completely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open as he stared blankly at the blaring red screen. The sheer magnitude of his monumental mistake crashed heavily onto his shoulders. The smug, arrogant smirk was entirely wiped from his face, instantly replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his face completely drained of color. He looked exactly like a man who had confidently stepped onto a fragile, rotting wooden bridge, only to realize he was standing over a bottomless, terrifying abyss. "Who are you?" Miller whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the simple words. "What is this? What did you do to my computer?" "I did not do anything to your computer." "Detective," I replied smoothly, leaning forward as far as the heavy steel chains would allow. "I simply allowed you to do your job. You attempted to process a highly classified federal agent as a common local criminal. Your system reacted exactly as it was programmed to react." Miller backed away from the table, his hands raised defensively in the air. He stammered frantically, trying to articulate a coherent thought, but his mind was completely short-circuiting. He knew the absolute uncompromising power of a top-tier federal lockdown. He realized in a single horrifying second that the elderly man sitting calmly in his interrogation chair was not a corrupt local wealth manager. I was a protected federal asset, and he had just illegally detained me based on a fabricated, unverified civilian tip. Before he could take another step, a series of heavy, incredibly fast footsteps echoed loudly down the exterior hallway. The sound was distinct, purposeful, and heavily militarized. The frantic, confused voices of the local precinct officers outside were abruptly silenced by a single commanding shout. The heavy, reinforced door of the small interrogation room was suddenly kicked forcefully open, crashing violently against the adjacent concrete wall with a deafening bang. The arrogant local detective practically threw himself against the far corner, utterly terrified by the sudden, overwhelming display of federal force. 6 heavily armed tactical agents flooded swiftly into the tight space, their dark tactical gear absorbing the harsh fluorescent light. They immediately secured the perimeter, their professional focus absolute. Finally, a tall, distinguished man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit walked slowly through the doorway, radiating an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. It was FBI Director Mitchell, my oldest, most trusted contact within the Department of Justice. He looked around the bleak room, his sharp eyes landing on the terrified local detective before locking onto me. The entire power dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The hunted prey was dead. The ghost auditor had officially taken command. Director Mitchell did not say a single word as he crossed the bleak interrogation room. He simply gestured with 2 fingers, and the lead tactical agent immediately stepped forward, producing a set of master keys. The heavy steel handcuffs binding my wrists to the scarred aluminum table were unlocked with a sharp, echoing click. I slowly stood up, massaging my wrists, and smoothed the lapels of my dark suit. The young, arrogant local detective was practically melting into the corner, his wide eyes darting frantically between the heavily armed federal agents and the man he had just threatened to throw into a maximum security prison. Mitchell turned his attention to the trembling detective, his voice carrying the calm, crushing weight of absolute federal authority. "You will immediately scrub all local logs of this encounter," he commanded. "You will forget this face, you will forget this name, and if a single whisper of this unauthorized detention reaches the press, I will personally ensure your career ends before the sun sets." The detective nodded furiously, entirely incapable of forming a coherent sentence. Mitchell turned back to me, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You took a massive risk letting them bring you in, Harrison," he said quietly, motioning for the tactical team to secure the hallway. "You could have triggered the federal override the moment the local cruisers arrived at your estate." I fell into step beside him as we exited the claustrophobic room, trading the stale air of the local precinct for the cool night breeze waiting outside. I needed them to feel victorious. I explained, my voice steady and cold. "Preston and Victoria are arrogant, but they are also deeply paranoid. If I had simply vanished, or if federal agents had intercepted the local police, they would have known the trap had failed. They would have immediately panicked, destroyed the secondary offshore ledgers, and scattered before we could secure the physical evidence. By allowing myself to be paraded out of my own home in handcuffs, I gave them the exact optical victory they desperately craved. I made them believe their flawless execution was complete. We approached a massive armored black command vehicle, idling quietly in the precinct courtyard. I climbed into the rear compartment, taking a seat in front of a bank of glowing surveillance monitors. Mitchell sat beside me, tapping a command sequence into the central console. The screens instantly flickered to life, displaying high-definition live satellite and drone feeds directly over my Alexandria estate. The trap had worked perfectly. With my perceived arrest publicly confirming their success, my family had completely dropped their guard. They were no longer behaving like careful, calculated conspirators. They were behaving like lottery winners. Through the thermal imaging and covert interior cameras my team had established, I watched the chaotic, greedy frenzy unfolding inside the mansion. Preston, Victoria, and Monica were hastily zipping up massive, incredibly expensive designer suitcases. They were actively preparing to completely abandon the estate. The financial data I had forwarded to Mitchell confirmed their ultimate destination. Preston had chartered a private jet scheduled to depart from a discreet local airfield in exactly 2 hours. Their flight plan was filed for a remote non-extradition country in South America. "Look at them," Mitchell muttered, shaking his head in disgust, as we watched Victoria frantically shoving velvet jewelry boxes into a leather duffel bag. "They truly believe they got away with it." "They believe they murdered a ghost," I replied softly, my eyes tracking Preston as he strutted confidently across the living room, pouring another round of vintage champagne. "It is time to show them that ghosts do not bleed." The armored command vehicle surged forward, leading a silent convoy of tactical units through the dark Washington streets. We drove with a singular, terrifying purpose, our headlights completely extinguished as we approached the perimeter of my sprawling property. Dozens of highly trained agents flooded out of the vehicles, moving like silent shadows across the manicured lawns. They methodically surrounded the grand house, securing every single exit and establishing an impenetrable federal perimeter. I stood in the cool night air, watching tactical teams take their final breach positions around the massive front doors of the estate. Inside the grand living room, the atmosphere of arrogant celebration was reaching its absolute peak. Through the audio feed still active in my earpiece, I could hear Preston laughing loudly, mocking my perceived downfall. He was confidently promising Monica a life of endless luxury, completely oblivious to the silent army currently massing just inches away from his expensive imported rugs. Mitchell gave a single sharp nod. The command was absolute. The massive custom mahogany front doors of the Alexandria estate, which had proudly protected my family for over 3 decades, were violently and instantly obliterated. A heavy military-grade tactical battering ram shattered the reinforced hinges with an incredibly deafening, concussive boom that completely shook the entire foundation of the house. Splinters of incredibly expensive wood and freshly shattered glass rained heavily across the pristine marble foyer. The immediate, terrifying chaos of a full federal breach consumed the pristine environment. Dozens of heavily armored agents poured fiercely into the grand living room, their tactical boots stomping mercilessly over the delicate Persian carpets. Piercing white tactical lights and solid red laser sights cut aggressively through the dim, elegant lighting of the room, painting a terrifying grid of absolute authority across the walls, the furniture, and the shocked faces of my family. Federal agents on the ground. "Nobody move. Get your hands in the air. Immediately." The commanding shouts echoed with deafening volume, instantly shattering the illusion of their perfect crime. Victoria let out a piercing, hysterical scream of pure panic, her hands flying to her face in utter disbelief. Monica stumbled backward, her expensive heels catching on the edge of a designer suitcase, sending her crashing heavily to the floor. The delicate crystal champagne glasses slipped from their trembling fingers, shattering violently against the hardwood, the expensive vintage wine pooling like blood around their feet. Preston stood completely frozen in the center of the room, his arrogant smirk entirely wiped from his face. The red laser sights danced aggressively across his chest, marking him as the primary target. He raised his trembling hands, his mind frantically scrambling to construct a plausible defense. "Wait. This is a terrible mistake," Preston yelled, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated terror. "You have the wrong person. I am completely innocent. The cartel accounts the money laundering, the fraud. It was not me, it was my father, Harrison." Caldwell is the criminal. He orchestrated everything. I am just a victim. The entire living room fell into a sudden, incredibly tense, heavily armed silence. The tactical agents held their positions, their weapons locked firmly onto the three terrified conspirators. The massive sea of dark, highly imposing tactical armor slowly began to part straight down the center, creating a clear, unobstructed path directly from the shattered front entrance to the middle of the living room. I stepped calmly through the ruined, smoking doorway, my tailored suit completely unwrinkled, my posture radiating an absolute unyielding and completely terrifying authority. Victoria stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, her face draining of all color. Her knees simply buckled. She collapsed heavily onto the floor, the sheer shock completely taking over. Preston stood completely paralyzed, his jaw working uselessly as he pointed a violently shaking finger in my direction. He desperately tried to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The arrogant, booming voice that had filled my headphones just moments ago was entirely gone. I walked slowly past the heavily armed federal agents, my footsteps echoing loudly in the grand living room. I carried a thick, heavy manila folder in my right hand. I stopped directly in front of the shattered crystal glasses and slammed the massive Department of Justice dossier onto the glass coffee table with a thunderous crash. The sharp sound made Preston flinch, as if he had been physically struck hard. "You genuinely believed you were the smartest person in the room, Preston," I said, my voice eerily calm. "You foolishly thought your elementary digital backdoors were completely invisible. But you forgot who built the digital house you were trying to rob." I leaned over the table, staring directly into the terrified eyes of my only son. "The cartel money you thought you so brilliantly washed is completely gone, Preston. The federal authorities seized every single cent of those illicit funds 3 days ago using my absolute overriding access codes. You have absolutely nothing left to your name. The massive offshore accounts you meticulously planned to access in South America have been frozen. The commercial flights you chartered are permanently grounded. The luxury lifestyle you violently stole from vulnerable pensioners has officially evaporated. You are not a wealthy mastermind escaping. You are a broke, exposed, and highly vulnerable thief who just stole $15 million from a ruthless international narcotics cartel." Preston let out a pathetic, suffocating gasp, staggering backward, as the horrifying reality finally crushed his arrogant spirit. I turned my attention away from him, looking down at the woman I had been married to for decades. Victoria was kneeling on the cold floor, trembling violently, completely unable to lift her heavy head. "You plotted my death with the casual indifference of planning a simple dinner party." "Victoria," I stated, my tone dropping to a cold, unforgiving whisper. "You truly thought your little synthetic blood thinner derivative was a stroke of absolute untraceable genius. You wanted my brain to violently drown in its own blood before the sun came up tomorrow morning. But you made a catastrophic, unforgivable mistake. And the dog survived the poison, Victoria. You carelessly tested the lethal liquid dosage on an innocent animal, assuming nobody would ever notice a sick hound wandering the estate. But my private veterinary team saved him, and the federal laboratory safely secured the primary vial you carelessly tossed into the outside garbage bin. You left your distinct, undeniable fingerprints all over the plastic bottle. The complex chemical analysis perfectly matches the deadly compound you happily planned to slip into my evening tea. The exact moment those damning words left my mouth, the fragile, deceitful alliance holding the three conspirators together were violently shattered into a million pieces. Monica let out a high, piercing, terrifying shriek. She scrambled frantically away from her husband, violently throwing her trembling hands into the air, turning her desperate, terrified gaze directly toward Director Mitchell and the stoic federal agents. "I had absolutely nothing to do with the violent murder plot," Monica screamed, her high voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic and profound cowardice. "It was all Preston and Victoria. They forcefully made me hide the financial ledgers. They aggressively made me lie to the federal investigators. I can easily give you the exact offshore account numbers right now. I can tell you exactly where Preston secretly hid the physical cartel contracts. I will happily testify to absolutely everything. Just please, I beg you, do not send me to federal prison. She actively threw the very people she claimed to deeply love directly under the speeding federal bus, desperately trying to save her own miserable skin. Director Mitchell stepped forward, his hardened expression completely devoid of mercy or sympathy. He signaled the tactical agents with a single sharp nod. "Handcuff all of them immediately," he commanded smoothly. The heavily armored agents moved swiftly, securing heavy steel cuffs tightly around the wrists of Monica, despite her frantic, sobbing, and pathetic confessions. Mitchell looked down at the broken, miserable trio shivering on the floor. "You are all under federal arrest," he declared, his booming voice echoing with absolute uncompromising authority. "You are formally charged with massive corporate money laundering, international wire fraud, and the attempted first-degree murder of Harrison Caldwell. You have the right to remain silent, and considering your current situation, I highly suggest you finally use it." I stood motionless in the devastated living room, my hands clasped firmly behind my back, silently watching as the federal agents roughly dragged my treacherous, deceitful family out of the Alexandria estate. Victoria wept uncontrollably, her incredibly expensive designer clothes deeply stained with spilled vintage champagne and common dirt. Preston heavily dragged his feet, his head hanging remarkably low, completely broken by the monumental, terrifying weight of his impending life sentence. Monica continued to loudly scream useless, ignored confessions as the heavy steel-reinforced doors of the armored federal transport vehicles slammed violently shut right behind them. I watched the flashing red and blue tactical lights paint the grand walls of my home until the massive convoy finally disappeared down the long, winding, tree-lined driveway. The sudden, profound, and absolute quiet of the large estate wrapped tightly around my tired shoulders. I slowly walked across the shattered marble foyer and stepped out onto the grand front porch. I took a deep, incredibly deliberate breath, filling my burning lungs with the crisp, clean, cold night air. The heavy, suffocating, and terrifying burden I had quietly carried for weeks was finally lifted from my chest. I had tragically lost a fake, highly manipulative family, but I had successfully protected my hard-earned, completely legitimate empire. I had remarkably preserved my own life, and I had fiercely defended my absolute professional honor. The greedy, incredibly arrogant predators who foolishly believed they could consume me had ultimately become the helpless prey. There is a profound danger in mistaking silence for weakness and age for incompetence. Greed blinds people to the reality that those who spent a lifetime building an empire know exactly how to protect it. When you attempt to destroy the foundation that feeds you, you will ultimately crush yourself beneath its weight. True power does not announce itself with loud threats or flashy displays of stolen wealth. It waits patiently in the shadows, gathers its strength, and strikes only when the victory is absolute. Never betray the hands that built your life, for loyalty is the only true currency. If you felt the adrenaline of this ultimate payback and believe that greed always gets what it deserves, smash that like button now. Do not forget to subscribe for more intense, satisfying stories of justice. Drop a comment below telling me which part shocked you the most.